We sang that song when I was a kid. When, often, I would have a hard time falling asleep at night. The usual cure was chasing down crooks with the Hardy Boys. But every once in a while the house was completely dark and everyone else was asleep, I would switch off my light, and child of the 80s that I would plug my big Sony headphones into my giant silver boombox and turn the radio dial to the local Christian radio station for Talk Back with Bob Larson. Talk Back was like a Christian horror show. Larson is the author of several books, including Curse Breaking and Demon Proofing Prayers, and is the founder of the International School of Exorcism, which I don't believe is accredited. He has developed an online quiz at demontest.com, which we can take for a fee to determine whether we're demon-possessed. As an evil expert, Bob Larson can see the devil a million miles away, mostly in the unholy trinity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He would delight his listeners night after night with tales of casting demons out of young Ozzy Osbourne fans, watching them crush their records with a sledgehammer, or of encountering an ancient Viking demon in a woman in Hackensack. If you were lucky, you might tune in to hear the grunting and growling of an online exorcism. Bob has changed with the times. He now has an exorcism YouTube channel with regular features called Ask the Exorcist. And if you can't make it to one of his shows, if you can't afford the ticket to have your devil expelled, Bob Larson has the cure. He performs online Skype exorcisms for $295. Since our demons are especially bullheaded, I think Unitarian Universalists are charged double. And as you may have already guessed, Bob Larson lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Our theme this month is good and evil. If Bob Larson is right about what evil is, if it's just some demons and ghouls creeping up on us in the night, then what are we doing talking about it? Well, the reason I love this theme is that it challenges us to reflect on the value in some ideas we might rather just leave behind because, frankly, we're a little embarrassed about their associations in our culture. I think we would be worse off if we did that. Reverend Earl Holt, who served this congregation as interim minister, wrote, "Liberal theology, if it can be said to have an overriding weakness, tends toward a sometimes unrealistic optimism. Hope is its central virtue. But essential as hope is, it is insufficient unless grounded in something deeper. A potent religion must address the darkness, inner and outer. That darkness is real. Moments of grace do come," he concludes, "but not easily or often, and it is most often those who acknowledge the darkness who recognize the grace." It's understandable that liberal faith has come to overemphasize the goodness of humanity and, for the most part, ignore evil. Early American liberal religion was a reaction against Calvinist preaching that every human baby is born sinful and repulsive in the eyes of God. Imagine being raised that way, then attending a Universalist tent revival and hearing a sermon about a God who loves everyone, no matter who they are, from the day of their birth. Or imagine hearing from the early Unitarians that human beings are inherently worthy and capable of great good. It was life-changing. What the Universalists and Unitarians did in our country was essential and life-changing. Over time, the inherent goodness of human beings has come to be assumed by most religious liberals. But these days, we bump up against another question. In defining evil in the following paragraphs, Paul Razor talks about it. How do we who emphasize the inherent worth and dignity of every person account for evil? Here's what UU theologian Paul Razor has to say. This is a difficult message for liberals to hear, he writes, so let me be as clear as possible. I'm not simply making a moral judgment that racism is wrong. He uses racism as his example of an evil. Nor am I making an anthropological claim that human beings have the capacity to do horrible things and create oppressive institutions. These statements are, of course, true. In fact, they represent the way religious liberals usually think about systemic evils. Instead, he says, I am making a theological claim. Racism is an evil, profound structural evil embedded deeply within our culture and within ourselves. It is a power. It's hard for religious liberals to talk in these terms because we have no real theology of evil, and therefore no language or conceptual reference points adequate to the task. Indeed, he says, this language has been difficult for me, but I've come to believe that any other approach is inadequate. Treating racism as an evil, a power that has us in its grasp, may help us realize more clearly what we're up against. This does not mean we need to think of it as a disembodied supernatural demon or the like, but to approach it as a human construct and nothing more misses the profound power it has over us. We're tempted to think it can be dismantled with the right motivation, with proper analysis and good programs. It will take all of these and more, but these by themselves are not enough. And Paul Racer concludes, instead, racism, once unleashed onto the world and embedded within human structures and institutions, takes on a life of its own. Like all cultural and institutional structures, it eventually becomes self-perpetuating and, to some sense, self-justifying. Despite our best and most persistent efforts to dismantle it, it keeps coming back in newer and ever more subtle forms. End quote. Evil exists as powers beyond individual control, which persistently hurt one group to advantage another. The question is, whom is evil helping? Could it be good for anyone? I talked last week about Unitarian Universalism's social class makeup, that we're mainly upper middle class. One of the many things that means is that we hold a lot of power in the form of resources and influence to make the world better. We also have a vested interest sometimes in keeping many things the way they are. Because, hey, for the most part, the system in which we're operating is benefiting us. Suggestions for big changes can come across as a threat. What do we do when our self-interest and our desire to make the world better butt up against one another? I wonder if that's when we might be able to use the word sin as religious liberals. It's not so different for us than for other religious movements, I think. Traditional religion says that sin means violating the will of God. Most Unitarian Universalists, if we talk about God at all, talk about God as a force within and beyond each of us, pulling the world toward the good. Think of Theodore Parker's moral arc of the universe again, which over a long time bends toward justice. Perhaps sin, then, for us, is choosing not to participate in the bending of that arc, though we know we should. Perhaps it is, as Alice Walker might say, not paying our rent for being alive. Alice Walker is, you may know, an author, a poet, and an activist who wrote, among other things, The Color Purple. This is her poem, To Change the World Enough, to give a sample of what she writes. To change the world enough, you must cease to be afraid of the poor. We experience your fear as the least pardonable of humiliations. In the past, it has sent us scurrying off, daunted and ashamed, into the shadows. Now, the world is ending. The only one all of us have known. We seek the same fresh light you do, the same high place and ample table. The poor always believe there's room enough for all of us. The very rich seem never to have heard this. In us, there is wisdom of how to share loaves and fishes, however few. We do this every day. Learn from us, we ask you. We enter now the dreaded location of earth's reckoning, no longer far off or hidden in books that claim to disclose revelations. It is here. We must walk together without fear. There is no path without us. Alice Walker is a tremendous poet and activist, a true voice of clarity in tumultuous times. An interviewer recently asked her, "What do you get from activism?" And she said what I said earlier. Well, it pays the rent on being alive and being here on the planet. There are things that you really owe, I feel, she said. I think if I weren't active, I would feel as though I were sitting back eating at the banquet without washing the dishes or preparing the food. It wouldn't feel right to me. So for us, as for Alice Walker, perhaps sin is ignoring the voice of good in us and thereby cooperating with evil in the world. We all do that. Don't we all, at one point or another, know we could do some good for someone or for the world and just decide not to? And every once in a while, we even do something that is designed to hurt someone. It's part of the human condition. It's not that goodness isn't there too, but accompanying it is another temptation. My colleague, Jeannie Harrison-Newyar, wrote, "Even as we affirm the prevailing goodness in human nature, we also need to acknowledge that these temptations or evil inclinations live within us. We need to hold these temptations, which sometimes become actions, within our religious embrace, so that there's a deep place for remorse, repentance, and forgiveness. Perhaps also for redemption, and certainly a place for healing and transformation. We need to acknowledge sin," she says, "to name it and accept its reality and power." So we don't have to look very far to find evil. It seems to me we can find these impulses within us. Of course we can. We are formed by the very systems we're working together to dismantle. It's a complicated place in which we find ourselves. Evils like racism aren't just social ills out there. If we're going to change these things, we'll have to do some soul work too, because we are implicit. To that end, I want to invite you to participate with me in a litany written by my colleague, Reverend Rob Eller Isaacs. In our hymnal, this litany is titled A Litany for Atonement. It's a way to ritually offer and receive forgiveness for our cooperations with evils in the world and to renew our commitment to do better. Your line is this, and you can see it on your screen. We forgive ourselves and each other and begin again in love. Will you practice that? We forgive for remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause. For each time our greed has blinded us to the needs of others. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For the selfishness which sets us apart and alone. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit. For losing sight of our unity. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For these and so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusion of separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. we have each and all not only experienced the effects of evil, but have cooperated with evil in the world. We have sometimes found it all too close. But friends, we are powerful people. Let us claim the privilege and power we have received to transform systems of evil and oppression in our hearts and in the world. And let us forgive ourselves and one another when we fail to do so. Let us finally continue to do the deep soul work necessary for this to be the case. Amen.